The day my daughter first suggested the assisted living facility, I was in my study reviewing the quarterly statements from the trust. I had just finished speaking with my attorney about the 3 properties I had quietly acquired over the past 22 years. When she knocked and came in with the brochure, she used the voice she uses when she believes she is being gentle. She said the garden courtyard would be perfect for me. She said there would be people my age. She said it would take the burden off everyone. I looked at the brochure. I looked at my daughter. I smiled and said I would think about it. She did not know that I had been watching her pattern for 11 months. She did not know that I had already spoken with 3 specialists who handle exactly what she was attempting. My name is Harold. I am 71 years old. What my daughter assumed about me was incorrect. What I understood about her was about to become very clear. I have been many things in my life: a husband, a father, a businessman, but I never expected to become a case study in elder financial exploitation. That is the clinical term for what my daughter tried to do to me. I prefer to call it what it is: an attempted theft of my home, my dignity, and everything I spent 5 decades building. And I saw it coming from 11 months out. It started with something she said at Sunday dinner. Words so casual I almost missed them. The dinner was a regular one: pot roast, green beans, the china my wife Margaret bought in 1978. Diana and her husband Rick came over twice a month, and I had learned to read the temperature of the room the moment they walked in. That night, Rick was too cheerful. Diana was too interested in my answers to questions she normally never asked. Somewhere between the meal and the coffee, she set her fork down and said, "Dad, have you ever thought about what you would do if the house became too much to handle, just hypothetically?" She used that word the way people use the word blessing when they are about to ask you for something. I said the house had never been too much to handle. I said I paid a young man down the street to mow the lawn, and I still did the rest myself. She nodded. Rick said something about agging in place being a great concept until it was not. He said his own grandmother had fallen and lain on the floor for 14 hours before anyone found her. He said they were just looking out for me. I thanked them for looking out for me. I did not tell them that I had already spoken with my attorney 3 days earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with lawn care and everything to do with the way Diana had started asking about my finances 6 weeks before. I did not tell them that I had noticed Rick had a new car he could not explain. I simply poured myself more coffee and let them talk. I have learned that when people are working an angle, the most valuable thing you can give them is silence. My wife Margaret died 8 years ago on a Tuesday in February. We had been married 41 years. She was the kind of woman who kept the books for my business when we were first starting out and never let me forget a single receipt, a single figure, a single obligation. We built a small manufacturing company together. We supplied specialty fasteners to the aerospace industry, and for 26 years, we employed 63 people in a plant outside of Cleveland. We were never famous, we were never on a magazine cover, but we were successful in the way that matters. We owned what we had outright. Margaret insisted on that. She grew up in a house where the bank owned everything, and the anxiety of it followed her into adulthood. When the business sold in 2005, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Harold, we are never going to owe anyone another dollar as long as we live." And we did not. The money was invested carefully. I bought 3 residential properties over the next decade, good houses in good neighborhoods that would hold value. I put them into a trust Margaret and I had established with clear instructions about our daughter. Diana was our only child. We loved her, but love and blind trust are not the same thing, and Margaret understood that better than anyone. She had watched her own brother bleed their parents dry over 15 years, small loans that became large loans, promises that became evasions. She said family and money were like water and electricity. They needed to be run through separate conduits or someone was going to get hurt. Diana was not a bad child. She was never cruel or dishonest in the ordinary sense, but she was always hungry for more than she had, and she was always convinced that more was just around the next corner if someone would help her get there. She married Rick when she was 31. Rick was handsome and articulate and worked in commercial real estate, which I have learned is an industry that attracts men who are very good at describing things that do not quite exist yet. He had big plans. He always had big plans. The plans changed every 2 or 3 years, but the confidence stayed the same. Margaret met him once before she died. She was in the hospital by then, and she held my hand after he left the room and said, "Watch him." She did not say it with anger. She said it the way you might say watch that patch of ice on the driveway. Practical, sober, I told her I would. For the first 7 years after Margaret passed, things with Diana were unremarkable. She and Rick lived in a townhouse on the other side of the city. They came for holidays. They sent birthday cards. Rick would sometimes corner me after dinner and talk about investment opportunities, developments he was involved in, things that sounded exciting and always required more capital than he currently had. I would listen and say I would think about it, and then I would do nothing. He never pushed hard. Not then. The shift began quietly, the way these things always do. It was not one moment. It was a pattern of small adjustments, tiny escalations, remarks that could be explained away, but added up to something unmistakable once you saw it in aggregate. Diana started calling more often. She started asking questions about my health in a tone that suggested she was expecting a different answer than the one I gave. She would say things like, "Are you sure you are sleeping okay? Are you sure the stairs are not getting difficult?" I would tell her I was fine, and she would say, "Well, if that ever changes, we are here." She said it with warmth, but the warmth felt rehearsed. Then the questions about the house started. At first they were indirect. How was the neighborhood holding up? Had I thought about putting in a downstairs bathroom just in case? Was the roof going to need work soon? I answered honestly. The neighborhood was fine. The house was fine. The roof had been replaced 4 years ago, and I had another 15 years on it. She would nod and look around the living room as if she were measuring it, not measuring the furniture, measuring the value. I had seen the look before in business negotiations, the moment when someone stops seeing a home and starts seeing an asset. In the spring, Rick came by himself on a Saturday afternoon. He had a briefcase with him, something I had never seen him carry before. He sat in the living room and told me he had been doing some estate planning of his own, and it got him thinking about my situation. He said Diana worried about me constantly. He said she was not sleeping well. He said they wanted to make sure everything was in order so that if something ever happened, there would be no complications. I asked him what kind of complications he had in mind. He mentioned probate. He mentioned taxes. He mentioned that it could take months for the house to clear the courts if my will was not structured correctly. He told me he had a friend, a very reputable attorney who specialized in elder transitions. He said it would give him and Diana real peace of mind. I looked at Rick for a long moment. He had Margaret's watch file on him playing in my head. I said I already had an attorney. He said of course, but a second opinion never hurt anyone. I said I would consider it. He left the briefcase unopened. I waited until his car was down the street, and then I called my attorney, Michael, who had handled Margaret's and my affairs for 22 years. I told him what had been happening. Michael listened. Then he said, "Harold, this is the opening move." He said he had seen this exact pattern more times than he wanted to count. He called it the soft probe, the casual concern that graduates into a recommendation that turns into a form that needs your signature. He said the next step would be a power of attorney or a joint account or a deed transfer, something that would give them access. He asked if I wanted to move anything around. I said not yet. I said I wanted to see how far they were willing to go before I stopped watching and started pushing back. Michael said to keep a log. He said if this ever went in front of a judge, a log would be the difference between a story and evidence. I started the log that night. 11 months went by, 11 months of questions that were not really questions and suggestions that were not really suggestions. Diana brought me brochures for retirement communities. Rick mentioned a structure where the house could be transferred into a family trust. They used words like protection and simplification and making things easier for everyone. I kept the log. I kept my silence. I kept watching. Until the afternoon, Diana came into my study with the brochure for the assisted living facility, and the voice she believed was gentle. She said the garden courtyard would be perfect for me. She said there would be people my age. She said it would take the burden off everyone. She did not know that I had already spoken with 3 specialists who handle exactly what she was attempting. She did not know that I had a folder in my desk drawer containing documentation of every property I owned, every trust arrangement, every conversation I had logged in the previous 11 months. She thought she was suggesting a retirement option. She was making her final move, and I was about to show her what she had actually been moving toward this whole time. I did not look at the brochure right away. I waited until she left. Then I picked it up from the corner of my desk where she had placed it, and I read every word. It was a facility called Greenfield Estates, 30 miles outside the city, in a town where the only landmark was a grain elevator and a church that had closed in 2012. The photographs were careful. There were smiling attendants. There were people my age sitting on shaded benches with soft blankets on their laps. The fine print at the bottom of the last page listed a monthly cost of $6,400, more than the mortgage on my entire first building had been in 1973, more than Margaret and I spent on our first house, our first car, and our daughter's entire first year of private school combined, and they had circled the number with a yellow highlighter. I opened the log. I wrote the date, the time, and the details. I added the name of the facility, the cost, the highlighter, the way she had used the word burden, as if my continued existence in my own home was a weight she had been carrying alone. Then I opened the folder Michael had prepared for me, and I reviewed the documents 3 weeks earlier than I had planned. What I found inside changed the trajectory of everything that followed, because Michael had not just drafted contingency plans. He had been investigating. Michael is not a man who raises his voice. He is 73 years old and has been practicing law for 48 years. He has the demeanor of a man who has seen every variation of human greed and is no longer surprised by any of them. When he called me the week before the brochure arrived, he said he had been doing some digging into Rick, not illegal digging, public records, court filings, business registrations. And what he found was a man whose financial life was a series of closed doors with broken locks behind them. Rick had been named in 3 lawsuits in the past 7 years. 2 of them were settled out of court. 1 of them was still active, a case involving a limited partnership that had been formed to develop a commercial property in Columbus and had collapsed under the weight of what the plaintiff's attorney called fraudulent inducement and unjust enrichment. Those were not Michael's words. They were the words in the court filing. But the more alarming discovery was not the lawsuits. It was a lien, a federal tax lien filed against Rick personally 18 months ago in the amount of $212,000. The lien was still open, still accruing interest, still sitting there like a second heartbeat under every conversation he had ever had with me about estate planning and tax efficiency and making things easier for everyone. I sat at my desk and I read that document 3 times. I thought about the new car Rick was driving. I thought about the briefcase he had brought to my house that Saturday. I thought about the voice my daughter used when she told me a retirement community would be perfect for me. And I understood, with the clarity that comes when the last piece of a puzzle snaps into place, that this had never been about my safety. It had never been about my comfort. It had been about my house, specifically the equity in my house, which was valued at nearly $700,000, which was owned free and clear, which represented the single largest liquid asset they could try to reach. Elder financial exploitation operates on a few simple principles. The perpetrator must gain access, the perpetrator must isolate the victim, and the perpetrator must convince the victim or the institutions around the victim that the transfer of assets is voluntary and rational. The legal system calls this undue influence, and undue influence is a slow process. It does not begin with a demand. It begins with a suggestion, a question, a gentle nudge toward a version of reality that has been carefully edited. Pattern Michael described to me was so familiar it felt like a blueprint. First, the soft concern. Have you thought about what you would do if the house got to be too much? Second, the establishment of dependency. You really should not be handling all these finances alone at your age. Third, the introduction of an expert. My friend is an attorney who specializes in elder transitions. Fourth, the document, the power of attorney, the trust amendment, the deed transfer. And fifth, the isolation. Once the asset is under joint control, the elder is moved into a facility where communication with outside parties becomes difficult. The family trust becomes the family cage, and the cage has a lock. Michael told me that in his 4 decades of practice, he had seen this pattern unfold more than 100 times. He said the perpetrators were almost always family members. He said adult children were the single most common category, accounting for nearly 40% of all substantiated cases. He said the average victim was older than I was, which gave me some small comfort that I was ahead of schedule. He said the estimated losses to elder financial exploitation in this country were somewhere between $20 and $27 billion every year. Most of it never recovered. Most of it never even prosecuted. because the victim was too ashamed to report it, or too dead, or both. He said that was why the log mattered. The log was not just a record. It was a counter-narrative, a competing version of events that could be introduced if anyone ever tried to claim I had given consent. I asked Michael what the worst case was. He paused. He said he had a client once, a woman named Elena, 86 years old, who had signed over her home to her son. The son had told her it was to protect the house from Medicaid. He had told her she could live there for the rest of her life. 6 months after the papers were signed, he sold the house to a developer and moved her into a facility in another state. Elena had no money for a lawyer. She had no family left to intervene. She died in that facility 3 years later. Michael said her son attended the funeral and cried. Michael said he was not sure whether the tears were real. I hung up the phone that night and I sat in the dark of my study for a long time. I thought about Elena. I thought about my own daughter. I thought about the fact that Diana had likely believed, at least in the beginning, that she was doing something reasonable. People who commit financial exploitation rarely think of themselves as criminals. They think of themselves as caretakers, as planners, as the only ones willing to make the hard decisions. They take the assets because they believe they are owed them. Because they have been waiting. Because the years have passed and the inheritance has not arrived, and somewhere along the way, they have converted a future expectation into a present entitlement. That is the psychology of it. And once that conversion happens, the only thing standing between them and the asset is the uncooperative fact that the elder is still alive. 3 weeks after the brochure, Rick called me directly, not through Diana, directly. He said he wanted to have a conversation man to man. He said he had been feeling that things between us had become strained and he wanted to clear the air. He suggested we meet at his office. I told him I would prefer to meet at the house. He agreed after a hesitation small enough that someone else might have missed it. He came on a weekday morning. I had taken the folder out of my drawer and placed it on the table beside my chair. Not opened, just present. Rick arrived in a suit that cost more than the monthly income from 2 of my rental properties. He sat on the same couch where he had sat a dozen times before for holiday conversations and football games and the ordinary traffic of a family that was pretending to be ordinary. He began by saying that Diana loved me very much. He said she had been under a lot of stress. He said the idea of me living alone in this big house was weighing on her in ways I might not fully appreciate. He said they had done some more research since our last conversation, and he wanted to share with me a proposal that he thought would work for everyone. He pulled out a document. It was not a brochure this time. It was a formal trust agreement, drafted on a law firm's letterhead, with blanks where my signature would go. The agreement proposed transferring the title of my home into a family trust with 3 trustees, Diana, Rick, and me. The language was dense. It used words like corpus and settlor and fiduciary obligation, but the essential architecture was clear. Once the house was in the trust, the decision about whether to sell it, when to sell it, and what to do with the proceeds would no longer be mine alone. It would be a collective decision, 2 votes against 1, and if I were to become incapacitated, the trust would grant them full authority to manage the asset on my behalf. Incapacity, I noticed, was defined in a way that included not just medical diagnoses, but the opinion of a single physician selected by the trustees. I read the document carefully. I took my time. Rick sat and watched me with the patience of a man who has been trained to wait. When I finished, I looked up and asked him a simple question. Were any of these legal provisions his idea, or had the whole thing come from the attorney? He said it was a collaborative effort. He said they had worked closely with the lawyer to make sure everything was structured for my benefit. I nodded. I asked if he would mind if I took a few days to review the document more thoroughly before giving an answer. He said of course. He said take all the time I needed. He was smiling as he said it, the smile of a man who believes he has just made an unrefusable offer. After he left, I photographed every page of the trust agreement with my phone. I emailed the photographs to Michael with a note that said simply, "This is the document." Michael called me back within the hour. He had already read through the entire thing. He said the structure was sophisticated. He said whoever had drafted it knew exactly what they were doing. It was designed to appear protective while being predatory. He noted a clause on page 7, buried in the definitions section, that would allow the trustees to charge reasonable expenses against the trust corpus, including management fees. There was no cap on those fees. There was no requirement that the fees be disclosed to me. Michael said that if I had signed that document, Rick and Diana could have drained the equity out of the house through administrative charges alone, without ever having to sell it. They could have done it slowly, incrementally, in amounts small enough to escape notice, until the house was an empty shell and I was living in a facility I had already been told was perfect for me. I asked Michael if he thought Diana knew. He was quiet. He said that was a question only she could answer, but he said that in his experience, the dynamics in these situations were rarely simple. Often the spouse was the driving force. Often the adult child was conflicted but compliant. He said he had seen parents who wanted desperately to believe their child was being manipulated. He had also seen parents who had to face the reality that their child was the manipulator. He told me to prepare for either possibility. I told him I had been preparing for 11 months. I asked what our next move was. He said we had two options. The first was to do nothing aggressive, wait, and see if they escalated further. The second was to call a meeting with Diana and Rick and present them with the full picture of what I owned, what I knew, and what the trust already established. He said the second option carried more risk because it would remove the element of surprise, but it would also force their hand. I told him I had never been a man who waited for the other side to make the next mistake. I told him to start drafting the letter. The meeting was set for the following Saturday. I chose the location carefully, not my home, not theirs, Michael's office, in a downtown building with a conference room that had a long mahogany table and windows that faced the courthouse. I wanted the setting to communicate what the words would reinforce. This was not a family conversation. This was a negotiation, and negotiations are conducted on neutral ground. On the morning of the meeting, I woke early. I made coffee. I walked through the house room by room, the way I used to do with Margaret on Sunday mornings when we had no plans and no obligations, and the whole day stretched out ahead of us like a promise. I stopped in the kitchen and looked at the window where the morning light came through in a particular way that still, after 43 years, made me think of her. I said something to her in my head. I do not remember what it was exactly. Something about doing right by what we built, something about seeing this through. Then I put on my jacket and I picked up the folder and I drove downtown. Diana and Rick were already there when I arrived. They were sitting on one side of the table. Michael was sitting on the other. He had set out water glasses and a printed agenda. Diana looked at me when I walked in. She looked confused. She had been told we were meeting to discuss some family planning matters. She had not been told that I had brought 22 years of legal architecture with me. She had not been told that I had a logbook full of dates and quotes and documented conversations. She had not been told that I had, 3 days earlier, retained a forensic accountant to examine every financial transaction Rick had made in the past 5 years that intersected with anyone over the age of 65. That investigation was still in its early stages, but its existence alone was a lever, and I intended to use it. Michael opened the meeting. He was calm. He said we were here to clarify some matters regarding my estate, my assets, and my intentions. Diana's face tightened. Rick's expression did not change, but his hands stopped moving. Michael began with the trust. He explained that Margaret and I had established it in 2001. He explained that it was irrevocable. He explained that it contained 3 residential properties valued at approximately $1.9 million. He explained that the primary residence was held separately in a life estate deed that guaranteed my right to occupy the house until my death, at which point it would pass directly to Diana without probate. Diana looked at me. Her face was doing something I could not quite read. Michael continued. He laid out the financial picture in plain terms. The manufacturing business that had sold in 2005 for a substantial sum. The investments that had been managed conservatively for 2 decades. The rental income that covered my living expenses with room to spare. And the explicit, ironclad language in every legal document that prevented any third party from accessing any asset or exerting any control over any trust property without my conscious, witnessed, independent, and notarized consent. When Michael finished, the room was silent. Diana was staring at the documents in front of her. Rick was staring at me. His face had gone still, not angry, not frightened, blank. The blankness of a man who has just realized that the floor he was standing on is not a floor but a trapdoor, and someone else is holding the rope. Diana spoke first. Her voice was smaller than I expected. She said she had not known about any of this. She said I had never told her. She said she had spent years worrying about me, years thinking I was barely getting by on Social Security, years trying to figure out how to take care of me because I never let her in. She said all of this, and tears came into her eyes, and I did not know whether those tears were real or whether they were the kind Michael's client Alina's son had cried at her funeral. I wanted them to be real. I wanted to believe that my daughter had been misled, that her husband had been the architect, that she had been a passenger in a vehicle she did not know was headed for a cliff. But I had been watching her for 11 months, and I had seen her face when she handed me the brochure. I had seen the way she had circled the price. I had seen the way she had never asked me directly what I had, because asking directly would have meant giving me the opportunity to answer, and she had not wanted my answer. She had wanted my signature. I spoke. I told her that I was sorry. I told her that I should have told her years ago. I told her that Margaret and I had intended to sit down with her and walk through everything when she was older, when she was settled, when the right moment arrived. I said the right moment had never seemed to arrive, and then years had passed, and then her mother was gone, and the habit of privacy had become harder to break than I expected. I told her that was my mistake. I told her I was fixing it now. I told her that none of what she and Rick had proposed in the trust agreement was necessary, because everything was already structured with more protection than their document could have provided. I told her I had been managing these assets alone and successfully for 8 years and intended to continue. I told her Rick had tax troubles I was aware of, and I suggested, gently, that she might want to ask him about them. That was the moment the room changed. Rick's blankness broke. He started to say something, but Diana turned to look at him, and whatever she saw on his face stopped him. She asked him what tax troubles I was talking about. He said it was nothing. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said it was being handled. She kept looking at him. She asked why he had not told her. He did not answer. Michael slid a copy of the federal tax lien across the table. Diana picked it up. She read it. She set it down. She looked at Rick again, and this time her expression was not confusion. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who has been told a story for years and has just seen a page from the original manuscript. The story did not match, and the person who had been telling it was not the person she thought. That is where I will leave this part of the story. In a conference room in downtown Cleveland, with a mahogany table between my daughter and her husband, and a document in her hands that had just rewritten her understanding of her marriage. Because what happened next is not what I expected. What happened next forced me to confront the difference between being watchful and being right, and the difference between protecting what you have built and losing something you thought was already secure. Diana lowered the paper. She did not look at Rick. She looked at me, and her face was the face of someone who has just discovered that the map she was following was drawn by a stranger. She asked me how long I had known about the lien. I told her about 3 weeks. She asked why I had not told her immediately. I said I wanted to understand the full picture before I brought it to her, and I said I was still waiting on a few pieces. She turned to Rick and asked him very quietly whether it was true. Rick opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at Michael. He looked at the door. He said it was a temporary cash flow issue. He said it was being handled. He said it had nothing to do with her or with me or with the trust agreement they had proposed. Diana stared at him. Her voice was still quiet when she asked him what exactly the $212,000 had been spent on. He said investments. He said market conditions. He said things that began in specific words and ended in general ones. She kept staring. She asked if there was anything else she needed to know. He said no. That was a mistake, because Michael was not finished. He opened a second folder. This one contained the preliminary findings from the forensic accountant I had retained. The accountant had been digging for less than a week, but he had already uncovered something neither Rick nor Diana knew existed. It turned out that Rick had not only a federal tax lien, he had also taken out a home equity line of credit on their townhouse 18 months ago. He had taken it out without Diana's signature. The loan was for $140,000, and he had managed it by filing a document with the bank that claimed Diana had signed a separate power of attorney authorizing him to act on her behalf. The document was dated 2 years earlier. Diana's signature was on it, but when Michael showed her the copy, she shook her head. She said she had never signed it. She said the signature looked like hers, but she had never signed anything like that. She looked at Rick and said, "What did you do?" Not a question, A statement with a question mark at the end. Rick stood up. He said this meeting had become adversarial. He said he thought we were here to discuss family planning, not to ambush him. He said he would be consulting his own attorney. Michael told him that would be advisable. Michael also told him that the forensic accountant had requested access to the full financial records of the trust proposal he had brought to me, including the law firm that drafted it. He said the firm's letterhead matched a firm that had been sanctioned by the State Bar Association 3 years ago for drafting instruments that facilitated elder asset transfers without adequate client counseling. He said the attorney who drafted the trust agreement was currently under investigation. Rick's face went through several colors. He looked at Diana. He said her name. She did not answer. He said they should leave. She did not move. He said it again. She looked up at him. She said she was not going anywhere. What happened next is something I have replayed many times since. Diana stayed in that conference room, but Rick left. He walked out of Michael's office with his jacket folded over his arm and his briefcase in his hand, and the expression of a man who has just watched a long investment turn to vapor. He did not say goodbye to me. He did not look back at his wife. He walked down the hallway and into the elevator, and the doors closed, and that was it. I did not know at the time that it would be the last time I ever saw him in person. I did not know that within 6 months, he would be living in another state, and the lien would have grown to include additional penalties, and the home equity line of credit would be in default, and the townhouse would be underwater, and the marriage would be over. All I knew in that moment was that my daughter was sitting at a mahogany table in a conference room that smelled like old paper and lemon polish, and she was shaking. Not crying, shaking. I asked Michael to give us a moment. He nodded and stepped out. The door closed. Diana and I sat alone on opposite sides of the table. The documents were still spread across the surface between us. The trust agreement, the tax lien, the forged power of attorney, the brochure for Greenfield Estates that she had brought me 3 weeks earlier. I had brought it with me. I set it on top of the stack. I asked her if she knew what the monthly cost of that facility was. She said she did. I asked if she had circled the number. She said she had. I asked why. She did not answer immediately. Then she said Rick had told her it was the responsible thing to do. He had said that getting me into a managed facility would free up the house for sale, and the proceeds could be used to pay for my care and also to invest in a development opportunity he was working on. He had told her it was a win for everyone. She said she had believed him. He said she had wanted to believe him. She said it had felt wrong, but she had told herself that feeling wrong and being wrong were different things, and she was not a financial expert, and Rick was, and she trusted him. She said all of this in a flat voice, as if she were reading from a script she had just discovered was a fraud. I listened. I did not interrupt. When she finished, I asked her the question I had been dreading to ask for 11 months. Did she know about the tax lien? She looked at me and her eyes were wet, but her voice did not waver. She said no. She said she had known about the business troubles, but Rick had always framed them as temporary. She said she had not known about the lien. She said she had not known about the home equity line of credit. She said she had not known her signature had been forged. She said she had been blind. She used the word blind. I believed her, not because I wanted to. Because I have spent a lifetime learning to read people, and what I saw in my daughter's face at that table was not calculation. It was collapse. But believing her did not resolve the situation, because here is the thing that Michael had warned me about and that I had not fully understood until that moment. Even if my daughter was a victim of her husband's deception, she was still the person who had handed me the brochure. She was still the person who had used the word burden. She was still the person who had never once asked me directly what my financial situation was, because asking directly would have meant giving me the opportunity to correct her, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she had preferred the version of me that was simple and dependent and convenient. That was not Rick's doing. That was hers, and I had to decide whether I could trust her again. I told her I needed time. She said she understood. She asked what I was going to do about Rick. I said that Michael was already in contact with the county prosecutor's office regarding the forged signature. I said the decision to pursue charges would be hers as much as mine because it was her name on the document. She nodded slowly. She said she would cooperate with whatever investigation was necessary. I told her I appreciated that. I told her that the trust Margaret and I had established was secure and that no matter what happened, Her inheritance was protected from Rick's creditors and from Rick himself. I told her that was what her mother had wanted. She closed her eyes at that. She said she wished Margaret were here. I said I did too, every single day. We left the conference room together. Michael was in the hallway on the phone. He nodded to me as we passed. Diana walked beside me to the parking garage without speaking. At her car, she turned and hugged me. It was a real hug, the kind she used to give when she was small and something had frightened her, and I was the only person who could make it right. I held on to her. I told her we would get through this. I told her I had not given up on family in 71 years, and I was not about to start now. She pulled back and looked at me and said she was sorry. She said she was so sorry. I told her I knew. But the story does not end there, because 3 days later, I received a phone call from a woman I had never met. Her name was Elaine. She was 78 years old. She lived in a condo on the north side of the city, and she told me that she had been contacted by a man named Rick approximately 2 years earlier regarding an investment opportunity related to senior housing. She said she had invested $60,000 with him. She had not seen a single cent of return. She said she had recently learned that I was his father-in-law, and she was calling to ask if I knew how to reach him because he had stopped answering her calls. She was not the last. Over the following 2 weeks, I heard from 4 other people, all of them over the age of 70. All of them had been approached by Rick with some version of the same pitch. Protect your assets, secure your future, trust me. The total amount they had given him collectively was just under $400,000. None of them had received a return. None of them had signed formal contracts. None of them had been told about the federal tax lien or the home equity line or the forged signature. They had trusted him because he was well-spoken and because he came recommended through a senior community network he had cultivated like a garden. He had been farming them. I called Michael. I told him about Elaine and the others. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that what I was describing was a pattern, not just elder financial exploitation within a family, but systematic elder fraud across a community. He said this was no longer just a civil matter. He said he was going to refer the case to the FBI's Elder Fraud Unit, which had been established specifically for situations like this. I hung up the phone and I sat in my study and I thought about the brochure for Greenfield Estates. I thought about the word burden. I thought about the way Rick had smiled when he handed me the trust agreement. And I understood that the assisted living facility was not the end of the plan. It was the beginning. The plan was not just my house. The plan was a network of houses. A pipeline of elderly homeowners with paid-off properties and adult children who were too busy or too distant or too trusting to notice. The plan was to move them into facilities, sell the properties, and pocket the proceeds through management fees and trust expenses and shell companies that existed only on paper, and Rick had been building it for years. Called Diana. I told her what I had learned. She listened. She did not make excuses. She asked what she could do. I said she could help me find the others. Anyone Rick had ever mentioned, any neighbor he had ever been friendly with, any elderly friend of mine he had ever asked about. She said she would start immediately. I told her I was proud of her. She was quiet for a moment. She said that was the first time I had said that since her mother died. I did not know that was true. But I knew it was true the moment she said it. I told her I was sorry. I told her I had let my silence become a habit, and the habit had cost us both. She said we had time. I said I intended to use it better. That is where the escalation ends and the reckoning begins. Because my daughter and I had to rebuild something that had been damaged not just by Rick's lies, but by my own long silence. And I had to decide whether watching and waiting had been wisdom or whether it had been a different kind of failure, wearing the clothes of strategy. The answer was not simple, and what came next clarified it in ways I did not anticipate. The FBI investigation took 8 months. During that time, Elaine and the 4 other victims I had spoken with were joined by 7 more. 11 people in total, all over the age of 70, all approached by Rick with the same polished pitch and the same reassuring smile. The total documented loss was just under $700,000. The actual number was likely higher because some victims were too embarrassed to come forward, and some had already died, and some simply wanted to forget. Rick had been methodical. He had attended senior expos and volunteered at community centers and joined a church with an agging congregation. He had not been building a business. He had been building a catalog. In April, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, aggravated identity theft for the forged power of attorney, and a charge specific to the elder fraud statute that had been strengthened 3 years earlier. The statute carried enhanced penalties for targeting victims over the age of 65 and for abusing a position of trust. Rick qualified on both counts. The indictment ran to 43 pages. Michael sent me a copy. I read it in my study with the door closed. I read every page. I read the names of the victims and the amounts they had lost and the specific lies Rick had told each of them. And when I finished, I set the document down and I felt something I had not expected. Not satisfaction, not anger, something closer to grief. Grief for the people who had trusted him. Grief for my daughter, who had married a man who turned out to be a stranger. Grief for the version of my family that had existed before all of this. The version I had believed was intact. Diana filed for divorce in March. The proceedings were not complicated. Rick had no assets left to divide, only debts. The townhouse was sold at a loss. The home equity line of credit was in default. The federal tax lien had grown to include penalties and interest and now stood at just over $260,000. Diana moved into a small apartment on the west side of the city. She got a job at a nonprofit that provided financial literacy education to seniors. She told me she wanted to help people learn to spot the warning signs she had missed. I told her that was a good thing to do. She said it was the only thing she could think of that made any of it feel useful. In June, she came to my house for dinner. Just her, no Rick, no briefcase, no brochure. We sat at the kitchen table where her mother and I had sat for 41 years, and we ate a meal I had cooked. Pot roast again. The same china. The same window with the evening light coming through. She looked around the kitchen and said she had always loved this room. She said she remembered sitting on the counter when she was small, watching her mother chop vegetables. She said Margaret would hum while she cooked, songs from the radio that I never knew the names of. I told her I remembered. I said her mother had always said the kitchen was the center of the house, the place where decisions got made and problems got solved and people got fed. Diana smiled. She said the kitchen and the study, the two places I never let anyone touch. I said some things were worth protecting. After dinner, we moved to the living room. I had prepared a folder, not the folder with the trust documents and the lien and the logbook, a different folder. This one contained a complete summary of everything I owned, everything the trust contained, and everything that would pass to her when I was gone. I had written it in plain language, no legal terms, no fine print, just the facts. The 3 rental properties, the house, the investments, the manufacturing business that had funded all of it. The total was just over $2.6 million. I set the folder on the coffee table between us, and I told her I should have done this years ago. I told her I was sorry for letting the silence last so long that it created a vacuum, and that the vacuum had been filled by someone who never should have been invited into it. She looked at the folder. She did not open it. She said she did not need to read it. She said it was not the money she had wanted. It was the trust. She said she had spent years feeling like a visitor in her own family, like there was a locked door somewhere and she did not have the key, and she had convinced herself that if she could just help me, if she could just take care of me, the door would open. She said she had let Rick convince her that taking care of me meant managing me. She said she knew now that those were not the same thing. She said she was still learning the difference. I told her the locked door was my fault. I told her Margaret and I had built a wall around our finances out of old habit and good intention, and we had never built a gate. I told her I had been watching her for 11 months, waiting for her to make the wrong move, and in all that time, I had never once considered that the right move would have been to sit her down at this table and say, here is who we are. Here is what we have. Here is what it means. I told her watching was not the same as protecting. I told her I had confused the two. She was quiet for a moment. She said she had confused protection with control. She said Rick had taught her that. She said she was unlearning it. Rick pleaded guilty in September. The plea agreement included a sentence of 6 to 10 years in federal prison, restitution to the victims, and a permanent prohibition from serving as a fiduciary or financial advisor of any kind. The sentencing hearing was held in a federal courthouse downtown. I attended. Diana did not. She said she had already said everything she needed to say to him in the conference room the day he walked out. I sat in the back of the courtroom and I watched Rick stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit that did not fit him well. He looked smaller than I remembered. He looked tired. The judge asked if he had anything to say. He read a statement from a piece of paper. He said he was sorry. He said he had made mistakes. He said he had let financial pressure cloud his judgment. The judge listened without expression. She said his crimes were not mistakes, they were choices. She said they were choices made over years against vulnerable people who had trusted him. She sentenced him to 8 years. The bailiff took him away through a side door. He did not look at me. I did not expect him to. I walked out of the courthouse into the September afternoon. The sky was clear. The air had the first edge of autumn in it. I stood on the steps for a moment, and I thought about all the people who had been hurt by a man I had once welcomed into my home. Elaine, the 10 others, my own daughter. I thought about the fact that none of the restitution would ever fully arrive because the money was gone, spent on a lifestyle that Rick had funded with other people's savings. I thought about the fact that my own vigilance, the thing I had been proudest of, had come at a cost I had not measured. I had protected the assets, but I had nearly lost my daughter, and I was still trying to understand whether the trade was worth it. In October, Diana and I drove out to the cemetery where Margaret is buried. It is a small cemetery outside of town, on a hill, with oak trees and a stone wall that runs along the eastern edge. Margaret's headstone is simple, her name, the dates, a line from a poem she liked. We stood there in the afternoon light, and I told Margaret what had happened, not out loud. In my head, I told her I had held the line. I told her the trust had held. I told her our daughter was safe, and our assets were intact, and the man who had tried to tear through everything we built was in a federal prison. I told her I was sorry for the years of silence. I told her I was trying to do better. Diana stood beside me with her hands in her coat pockets. She asked what I was thinking. I said I was thinking about her mother. She nodded. She said she thought about her every day. She asked if I thought Margaret would have been disappointed in her. I looked at my daughter. I said no. I said her mother would have been furious at Rick, and she would have been sad that it took a crisis to bring us back to each other, but she would not have been disappointed. I said Margaret believed in repair. She believed that things broke so they could be rebuilt stronger. Diana looked at the headstone. She said she hoped that was true. I said it was. I said I was counting on it. The final surprising detail came in November. The forensic accountant, who had continued working through the records long after the criminal case was resolved, found something none of us expected. Buried in the financial documents for one of Rick's failed development projects was a record of a deposit. The deposit had been made 5 years earlier. The amount was $50,000, and the source, traced back through 3 shell accounts, was my own daughter. Diana, without knowing it, had funded the earliest stage of the scheme that would eventually come for her own inheritance. She had given Rick the seed money for a project he told her would secure their future. The project had never existed. The money had been used to pay off earlier debts and to create the appearance of wealth that would lure the first wave of elderly investors. When I told Diana, she sat down at my kitchen table and was silent for a long time. Then she said, almost to herself, that the worst lies were the ones you told yourself. She said she had wanted so badly to believe Rick was the answer to something that she had ignored every question. I told her that was not a crime. I told her that wanting to believe in someone you loved was not weakness. She asked what it was then. I said it was human. I said the task was to learn from it without letting it harden you. She said she was working on that. I said I was too. That is where the story lands, not in triumph, not in tragedy, somewhere in between, in the place where a man who spent too many years being watchful learns to be open, where a daughter who was nearly lost finds her way back, where a house that was almost taken becomes a home again. I still live in the same house. I still drive the same car. I still fix my own pipes. I still walk to the diner on Tuesday mornings and eat the same breakfast I have eaten for 20 years. Nothing about my life looks different from the outside, but the inside has changed. The silence has been broken. The door that was locked is now open, and my daughter has a key. What happened to me is not unusual. That is the thing I have had to sit with in the months since all of this ended. The details of my case were specific. The tax lien, the forged signature, the brochure with the circled number. But the shape of it, the architecture of the thing, is so common that there are government agencies built specifically to track it. Every year, older Americans lose somewhere between $20 and $27 billion to financial exploitation. Most of it at the hands of family members, most of it unreported, most of it never recovered. The victims are not always frail, they are not always confused. Sometimes they are just quiet people who built something slowly and never thought to broadcast it. And the predators are not always strangers with elaborate schemes. Sometimes they are the people who sit at your dinner table, the people who use words like protection and planning and making things easier for everyone. The people who tell you they are just looking out for you. I was lucky. I had an attorney who had seen the pattern before. I had a wife who had insisted on legal structures that could not be broken by a well-drafted trust agreement and a forged signature. I had the time and the clarity and the stubborn patience to watch for 11 months while the plan revealed itself, and I had the resources to push back when it finally arrived. Most people do not have all of those things. Most people have one or two of them at best. Most people trust their children. And most of the time, that trust is rewarded. But when it is not, the cost is not just financial. It is the loss of something harder to quantify, the belief that your family is safe, the belief that the people closest to you see you as a person and not as a future transaction. I think about the other victims Rick left behind, Elaine and the 10 others who came forward. They were not weak people. They were not foolish people. They were people who believed a well-dressed man with good references and a warm smile. They were people who had spent their lives building something and were trying to be responsible with it. They were people who had children of their own, children who were busy or distant or simply unaware. And Rick found them the way a contractor finds a job site. Scanning, calculating, measuring, looking for what could be acquired. The question I return to, the one I cannot fully answer, is this: was my vigilance a form of wisdom or a form of failure? I protected the assets. I held the line. The trust stood. But I also let 11 months pass in which my daughter was drifting further into a deception I could see more clearly than she could. I had the information that would have shattered Rick's story months earlier. I chose to wait. I chose to watch. I told myself it was strategy, and maybe it was. But maybe it was also the old habit of a man who had spent so long keeping things private that he had forgotten how to open the door. Margaret used to say that silence is a tool, but it is also a wall. She said you had to know which one you were building. I'm not sure I always knew. I am trying to learn. For anyone watching this who recognizes something in my story, I will tell you what I wish I had understood sooner. If you have built something, tell the people who need to know, not for their sake alone, for yours, because silence creates gaps and gaps get filled, and the people who fill them are not always the people you would have chosen. If you are the adult child of an nagging parent, ask the questions directly. Do not assume. Do not circle. Do not hand them brochures before you have handed them the respect of a real conversation. The conversation may be uncomfortable. Have it anyway. The alternative is worse. And if someone in your life is using words like protection and planning and simplification while positioning themselves between you and what you own, pay attention. That is not always a red flag, but it is always a reason to slow down and ask who benefits from the structure they are describing. Ask it out loud. Watch how they answer. Watch who they look at when they answer. That glance will tell you more than the words. My name is Harold. I am 71 years old. I still live in the house my wife and I bought 43 years ago. The oak tree in the front yard that she planted the year my daughter was born is still there. It still drops acorns on the driveway every autumn. I still sweep them up myself. My daughter comes for dinner now, not out of obligation, not with a brochure. She comes because we are rebuilding something that was almost lost, and because she has learned that the word burden is a word other people assign to you. It is not a word you have to accept. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The pattern I lived through is real, it is common, and it is survivable, but only if you see it coming. Thank you for listening. Now you know what to watch for.